Welcome to my channel. Today we dive deep into a chilling real-life story that began as just another calm day in the skies but turned into one of the most breathtaking and terrifying moments in aviation history. It was the day a quiet flight over Canada became a desperate battle against gravity, silence, and fate. This is the story of Gimli glider incident, the day Air Canada Flight 143 lost all power at cruising altitude and left everyone, from passengers to air traffic control, holding their breath as a Boeing jet turned into a powerless glider high above the earth. It began with a routine departure from Montreal Mirabel International Airport, the kind of smooth, everyday flight that travelers trust without a second thought. The Boeing 767 sat gleaming under a pale blue sky, its engines humming with that comforting roar that usually means safety, strength, and control. Passengers boarded with coffees in hand, some laughing softly, some tired, some simply eager to get to their destination. Up front, the cockpit was calm, two experienced pilots settling into their flight plan, running through their checklists with practiced ease. No one in that aircraft imagined that within hours, they would be staring at silent engines and an empty sky, with no power, no thrust, and no second chances. The takeoff was smooth, the kind of climb pilots love. The aircraft ascended through clear skies, reaching its assigned cruising altitude above the Canadian wilderness. Everything about the flight felt ordinary. The engines purred, the cabin lights glowed softly, and seatbelts loosened as passengers relaxed into that familiar, safe rhythm of air travel. But beneath that calm exterior, a mistake was already alive, silent, invisible, and waiting. A simple fueling error, a miscalculation of weight and conversion between pounds and kilograms, meant that this jet, designed to carry enough fuel to cross entire provinces, was flying with less than half of what it needed. No one on board knew. Not the pilot, not the mechanics, not the passengers laughing and sipping their drinks as the aircraft carved through the upper air. The first hint that something was wrong came quietly, almost too quietly. Inside the cockpit, a low warning tone buzzed, a sound the captain and first officer knew by heart. It wasn't an alarm that demanded panic. It was more like a whisper, a reminder that something, somewhere, wasn't as it should be. They glanced at the fuel indicators. One of them read low. They frowned. The aircraft's systems were advanced for its time, designed to keep pilots informed of every detail. And yet, the numbers didn't make sense. At first, they suspected a sensor malfunction. These things happened, and usually they were nothing. They radioed the control tower to report the irregular reading, adjusting their flight plan slightly. Passengers were still unaware. Flight attendants continued their service, their voices soft and calm, the cabin still carrying that illusion of safety. Then came the second warning. Sharper, louder, more urgent. One by one, systems began to flash. The cockpit, once bathed in steady green indicators, was now alive with yellow and red glows. The captain tightened his grip on the yoke as the low fuel warning triggered again. This time there was no doubt. The engines were being starved. At 41,000 feet, surrounded by the cold, thin air, Flight 143 had no place to land, no immediate runway below, and no time to waste. And then, silence. The right engine sputtered, its once steady roar breaking into a harsh, dying cough. The aircraft shuddered as the power dropped, the passengers feeling the faint but unmistakable change in vibration. People looked up from their seats, some frowning, some gripping their armrests. The pilots exchanged a single look. No words were needed. One engine was gone. They followed their training, turning to the checklists, preparing for an emergency descent if needed. A twin-engine aircraft could survive on one. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. Then, in a single, gut-punching moment, the left engine followed. The roar that had filled the plane's bones since takeoff faded away, replaced by the soft whistle of wind rushing past the fuselage. For the first time in their careers, the flight crew were sitting in a 767 that had gone completely silent. Every pilot knows that sound isn't just noise. It's reassurance, It's life. And when it's gone, the quiet is deafening. The captain's hands were steady, but the silence pressed on everyone like a weight. In the cabin, the change was instant. The air felt different, heavier. Passengers shifted nervously as the nose of the plane dipped slightly. Overhead bins rattled softly. Somewhere in the back, a baby began to cry, its high, thin wail slicing through the quiet. A flight attendant's practiced smile flickered for a heartbeat before returning, but her hands trembled just enough for the man in seat 14A to notice. He reached for the armrest, heart pounding. In the cockpit, they switched to glide protocols. The plane was no longer a jet. It was a massive, heavy glider with no power, no hydraulics except for a limited backup, and no margin for error. The altimeter numbers ticked down slowly but steadily, gravity doing its merciless work. The captain's voice broke the silence over the radio, calm but urgent, declaring a total power failure. On the other end, the controllers froze for a split second, staring at their radar screens. Planes don't just lose both engines. Not at cruising altitude. And yet, here it was. Flight 143, powerless, falling. The control towers scrambled, their calm professionalism turning into clipped, precise urgency. Alternate runways were checked, terrain maps were scanned, calculations thrown across the room like weapons. But they all knew the truth. The 767 was too high to land immediately and too low to glide indefinitely. It was trapped in a narrow corridor of time and distance. Inside the cabin, the passengers felt the change in altitude. It wasn't a nosedive. It wasn't chaos. It was something far worse, a slow, unstoppable drop like an elevator with no brake. People began whispering to each other, confused and scared. Some tried to convince themselves it was turbulence. Others knew. One woman gripped her husband's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. A boy stared out the window, watching the clouds rush up toward them. The crew's training kicked in like muscle memory. The captain and first officer scanned for the nearest airfield. Then, a single name lit up their minds like a lifeline: Gimli Industrial Park Airport, a decommissioned military airstrip miles away. It wasn't a major runway. It wasn't even meant for commercial jet. But it was their only chance. The captain adjusted their glide path, steering the silent jet toward a strip of cracked asphalt in the distance. But fate wasn't finished testing them. The plane's main power was gone, and so was most of the hydraulic pressure needed to control it. Every movement of the controls was heavier, slower, like trying to steer a dead weight. Inside the cockpit, sweat ran down the captain's back. He could hear every creak, every rush of wind against the fuselage. And then came the warning that every pilot dreads: the landing gear. With no power, it wouldn't deploy normally. They were going to have to drop it manually, mid-glide, while falling through the sky. In the cabin, fear was no longer quiet. It was growing in whispers and wide eyes. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, trying to sound calm, but passengers heard the tremor she couldn't hide. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an issue. Please remain calm and seated." But calm wasn't an option. People could feel the weight of the descent in their stomach. They could hear the difference: the absence of engine noise, replaced by the endless wind. The pilots worked together, forcing the gear down manually. The plane shuddered violently as two wheels locked into place. The nose gear failed to deploy fully, stuck halfway. They were now aiming a powerless, massive jet at a runway too short and half-prepared, with partial landing gear. And then, another twist: Gimli wasn't empty. It was hosting a community event, and the runway was scattered with people, cars, and children. As the 767 broke through the clouds, its silver body gliding silently like a ghost, people on the ground looked up and froze. They saw the plane, but they didn't hear it. One man dropped the hot dog in his hand. Another grabbed his kids and started running. The captain saw them too. His heart slammed once in his chest, but his hands didn't shake. He aimed for the farthest stretch of the runway, pulling the yoke gently, bleeding speed while keeping enough lift to clear the crowd. The plane sliced low over their heads, so close that hats blew off. The belly of the aircraft scraped the air like a giant blade. Inside, passengers gripped their seats, eyes squeezed shut, praying to gods they'd never spoken to before. The first tires touched down in a scream of rubber and steel. The landing was hard, violent, and uncontrolled. Sparks exploded from the nose gear as it collapsed beneath the weight, the front of the plane slamming into the runway with a sound that seemed to split the air itself. The entire cabin lurched forward as metal screamed against asphalt. Oxygen masks swayed wildly above passengers' heads. The fuselage vibrated so hard it felt like it might rip in two. But the pilots didn't stop. They used the plane's weight, its wings, and their training to turn disaster into control. The jet skidded, slowing, the crowd on the runway scattering like waves before a ship. In the cockpit, the captain's knuckles were white against the yoke. He could taste blood where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek without realizing it. And then, finally, the grinding slowed, softened, and the aircraft shuddered to a halt on the cracked tarmac of Gimli. Silence again. But this time, it was a silence filled with breath, with heartbeat, with disbelief. For a long moment, no one moved. Passengers sat frozen, hands gripping armrests, seatbelts locked, ears ringing from the impact. Then, as the emergency lights blinked softly and the smell of burning rubber filled the cabin, the first sob broke the quiet. A woman cried into her husband's shoulder. A flight attendant whispered a prayer. In the cockpit, the captain exhaled, the weight of everything crashing into him at once. They had done the impossible. The evacuation began fast. Slides deployed, people tumbled out into the cool Canadian air, legs shaking, some barefoot, some still clutching their belongings in numb disbelief. On the tarmac, families held each other. A boy stared up at the plane, its nose buried into the runway, and whispered, "We didn't crash." His father whispered back, "No. We landed." Later, the investigation would uncover the simple, tragic error that had led to this extraordinary event, a miscalculation of fuel caused by confusion between metric and imperial units. A mistake so small that it slipped through layers of check. A mistake that almost turned a routine flight into a mass tragedy. But it was also a story of skill, of calm under pressure, of a crew who refused to surrender to silence and gravity. Gimli glider incident became legend, not just for what went wrong, but for what went right when everything else failed. It reminded the world that sometimes survival isn't about perfection. It's about courage, training, and the unyielding will to bring everyone home. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me through this incredible story. If you love hearing real, powerful stories of survival, courage, and the human spirit in the skies, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories to tell, and together, we'll keep their voices alive. The first engine failure happened so softly that no one in the cabin noticed at first. At 41,000 feet, surrounded by the clear blue Canadian sky, Air Canada Flight 143 was gliding smoothly toward its destination, the engines humming like a heartbeat in the background. It was the kind of flight that lulled everyone into a false sense of safety. Smooth, calm. He pulled up the power grid for this deck, his fingers flying over the cracked interface. "If I reroute the airlock safeties and trip the coolant lines," he muttered, "I can force a station safety alert. It'll lock every retrieval unit in containment protocols." The vet arched a brow. "That's going to piss them off." "Good," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. Another impact on the door. Louder this time. The girl flinched, eyes wide, her breathing quickening. Ethan turned back toward her and forced his voice soft. "Hey, look at me. You're safe." He didn't know how much of it she understood, but she didn't look away. The vet moved to the back wall, flipping open the old emergency chute, an abandoned maintenance access that led down into the lower deck. No one used it anymore. No one but smugglers and ghosts. "If you're serious about keeping her away from them, this is your only path," she said. "It's dark, it's filthy, and it smells like engine coolant. But the council won't look for anyone down there. They think they're too important to crawl. The door groaned under another hit. This time, it didn't just shake, it bent. Ethan rushed back to the girl's side, carefully lifting her into his arms. She was still weak, but she didn't resist. Her head rested against his chest, her golden light casting long shadows on the walls. He glanced at the vet. "You're not coming?" She shook her head. "I'll hold them off. I've got more years on this station than their whole retrieval unit put together. They'll waste time trying to control me." He hesitated for a heartbeat. "They'll arrest you." She smirked. "They've tried before." The door split at the top corner with a screech of metal. Council enforcers were close now. Ethan stepped toward the chute, the cold air from below crawling up around his legs. The girl clung to his shirt, eyes darting toward the sound of the breaking door. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're leaving." The vet crossed to him in 2 steps and grabbed his shoulder, not gently. "You understand what this means, right? Once you disappear, you can't just fix ships and stay invisible anymore. You're taking a stand. That's a dangerous thing." Ethan met her eyes. "I know." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, releasing his shoulder. "Then make it count, kid." The final blow hit the door. Metal screamed. The seam tore open like a wound, bright white light from the hallway spilling in as 3 council enforcers stepped through in perfect formation, faceless helmets reflecting the bay's flickering light. The lead drone floated behind them, cold and silent, its retrieval clamps extended like blades. But Ethan was already gone. He slid down into the chute with the girl in his arms, the cool air whipping around them as they disappeared into the lower decks. The vet stood alone in the room, facing the council enforcers. She cracked her knuckles and gave them a grin that had nothing kind in it. "Took you long enough," she muttered. Down below, Ethan landed on the maintenance floor with a grunt, his boots splashing into puddles of old coolant. The lower decks were silent except for the distant rumble of engines and the slow drip of leaking pipe. No one came here anymore. It was forgotten space, a graveyard of old systems and older ghosts. Perfect for disappearing. The girl shifted weakly in his arms, blinking up at him with wide, gold-lit eyes. For the first time, Ethan smiled. Not a big smile, not one of triumph, but something quiet and certain. "We're not done," he said softly. "Not even close." Far above them, the council thought they were tightening their control. They didn't know they had just lit the fuse. Because one human refusing to let go wasn't just a small act of rebellion. It was the kind of story that burned through walls, across stations, across entire empires. And now that story was on the move. He was fighting to keep a metal giant alive without the engines that gave it breath. In the cabin, the pressure changed. Ears popped. Passengers felt that strange weightless pull in their stomachs, the unmistakable sensation of descent. A child began to cry. A man pressed his forehead against the window and whispered something to himself. No one could hear what the pilots were saying behind the locked door, but they could feel the urgency. And then the controller's voice cracked over the radio, strained but composed. "Air Canada 143, Gimli runway is your best option. You have no other reachable field. We'll clear the area." The captain acknowledged. No time for fear. No time for anything except precision. He angled the nose ever so slightly downward to preserve the glide, and in the silence of that powerless aircraft, every soul on board began to realize how fragile their fate had become. This was no longer a routine flight. This was a race against altitude, against distance, against time itself. The only thing between them and the ground now was human skill, steel wings, and hope. As the powerless jet cut through the thin air, the silence became unbearable. It wasn't the comforting quiet of a peaceful flight. It was the sound of everything that should have been alive, dying. No engine roar. No hum beneath the floor. Just the steady whistle of wind slipping past the wings as Air Canada Flight 143 glided through the open sky like a wounded bird. The captain and first officer worked in perfect, urgent rhythm, hands moving over switches that no longer held power, voices calm even as their pulse hammered against their ribs. They weren't flying anymore. They were falling, slowly, deliberately, but still falling. And every second mattered. The instruments on the flight deck had shifted from their familiar stable readings to the language of survival. Altitude numbers ticked down steadily, each 1,000 feet gone like a heartbeat. The airspeed fluctuated dangerously at the lower end of what the jet was designed to handle. The backup rat turbines screamed in the wind, a thin, desperate whine that barely powered the essentials. It was enough to control the aircraft, barely, but not enough to forgive even the smallest mistake. The captain gripped the yoke tighter, knuckles white, eyes locked on the glide path. Beside him, the first officer worked the radio, talking to controllers who understood the terrifying reality unfolding but could do nothing except clear a path and pray they made it. Far below, the land stretched out in endless shades of green and gray. The captain's eyes darted to the old map clipped near his knee. Gimli Industrial Park Airport was ahead, a decommissioned strip once used by the military. If they were lucky, they could make it. If they weren't, they'd be forced to put the aircraft down in open fields, or worse. He knew the jet's glide ratio. He knew the distance. And he knew that the margin between survival and disaster was thinner than a line of ink on the chart. In the cabin, that creeping fear had taken a different shape. The passengers weren't just unsettled anymore. They were listening. Listening to the unnatural absence of engine noise, the low hiss of rushing air. People began to exchange looks, strangers suddenly bound together by a silent terror they couldn't name. A mother clutched her son closer, her trembling hands brushing through his hair as if to ground herself in something real. A businessman who'd spent the first half of the flight buried in reports now sat with his eyes fixed on the window, the paper forgotten in his lap. He didn't need technical words to know something was wrong. Everyone could feel the slow, unstoppable descent pressing against their chests. The flight attendants moved with practiced grace, but this wasn't like any drill. Their smiles were thin, voices steady but sharp with hidden urgency. One attendant whispered to another at the back of the plane, "It's too quiet." The other nodded once, jaw set. Training kept them moving. They checked seatbelts, cleared aisles, made sure passengers were braced for something they hadn't yet been told. In the cockpit, the captain ran the landing checklist with deliberate calm even though they both knew many of those items meant nothing now. With no engine power, systems that would normally lower the landing gear automatically were useless. Everything had to be done manually. The first officer flipped open the access panel for the manual gear crank, his hands moving quickly, cranking the gear down as the aircraft continued to fall through the sky. A deep metallic groan echoed beneath their feet, and with a jarring lurch, the main landing gear locked into place. But the nose gear jammed halfway, refusing to fully deploy. It was hanging there, half extended, unstable, a risk they would have to accept. The captain's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "We'll work with what we've got," he said. They didn't have the luxury of perfection. They had gravity and steel. The control tower's voice crackled through the static. "Air Canada 143, Gimli runway is being cleared. You are clear for emergency landing. Wind is calm. You are 35 miles out. 35 miles. With no engines. No backup. Just altitude bleeding away like sand through fingers." "Roger that," the captain answered, his voice a wall of control holding back the fear clawing at the edges. He glanced at the airspeed, did the math again in his head. They'd make it, barely. But only if everything stayed steady. Only if nothing else failed. Back in the cabin, one of the flight attendants finally picked up the intercom. Her voice came through the speakers like a lifeline and a warning all at once. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for an emergency landing. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions carefully. Fasten your seatbelts tightly, and listen for further announcements." The words hit the cabin like a wave. Emergency landing. Passengers who had been whispering fell silent. Hands clenched armrests. Someone began to cry softly in the back row. Another person whispered a prayer under their breath. Fear didn't need translation, it spread like wildfire. As the plane continued its glide, the ground came closer, slowly but unmistakably. The captain pulled gently on the yoke, adjusting the pitch to stretch every ounce of distance out of their dwindling altitude. The cockpit air had turned thick, warm with tension, the quiet broken only by the wind and the occasional clipped voice of the controller trying to keep his own fear out of his tone. Then came the sight no one expected. As the plane dropped through the lower cloud layer, the runway appeared ahead, but something was wrong. Tiny shapes moved across it. Cars. People. It wasn't an empty military airstrip. Gimli Industrial Park Airport was being used that day for a local event, families scattered across the tarmac for a go-kart race. The runway wasn't clear. It was alive. In the cockpit, both pilots froze for half a heartbeat. The captain's mind moved fast, calculating angles and space in a blink. They had one shot. One glide. One landing. There was no power to go around again. No thrust to adjust their path. The runway was shorter than it should have been for a jet this size. The landing gear was unreliable. And now it was crowded with people who didn't even know death was gliding silently toward them. He gripped the yoke tighter, voice low but steady as he told his first officer, "We're committed. We're taking it in." It wasn't a question. It was a fact. The first officer nodded once, steel in his eyes. The landing checklist was useless now. All they had left was skill, gravity, and precision. Down in the cabin, the descent grew sharper. The airframe moaned under the strain, the sound vibrating through every seat. People gasped as they felt their stomachs lift, the unmistakable feeling of dropping. The boy who had asked why it was quiet earlier now clung to his mother's arm. A man whispered, "Please, please, please," over and over like a mantra. Every heartbeat was louder than the wind outside. The captain lined up with the runway, the silver wings gliding silently toward a strip of cracked asphalt filled with people who had no idea what was coming. And in that silence, in the long seconds before impact, every soul on that plane held its breath. This wasn't just a landing anymore. It was survival being carved through the air with nothing but human hands. The runway was no longer a distant line on the horizon. It was rushing toward them, fast, uneven, and alive with the movement of people who still hadn't fully grasped what was happening. Air Canada Flight 143, a massive Boeing 767, was gliding silently through the air like a ghost, no engines, no thrust, no margin for error. The only thing between 200 souls and disaster was gravity, steel, and the hands of two pilots who had no second chance. The captain lowered the nose slightly, his breath steady but shallow, sweat gathering at the base of his neck despite the cool cockpit air. His voice was low, precise, controlled. "We're going in," he said, and every muscle in his body moved with that decision. From above, the runway didn't look like a place to land a passenger jet. It looked small, narrow, crowded. What the flight crew couldn't fully see yet was the chaos on the ground. The old airbase was hosting a local event that day, people picnicking on the edges, kids racing go-karts, cars parked along the strip. None of them expected a commercial airliner to fall out of the sky and aim straight for them. At first, some thought it was a flyover, a military exercise, a display. But then they noticed the silence. No engines. Just the enormous silver body cutting through the air with terrifying stillness. In the cabin, the final announcement had already been made. "Brace, brace, brace," the flight attendants shouted, voices trembling but strong, every syllable cutting through the fear like a blade. Passengers leaned forward, hands locked on the seats in front of them, hearts hammering so loud it felt like it filled the plane. Some whispered prayers. Others closed their eyes. A few clutched the hands of strangers, their lives suddenly tied together by a single moment hanging between sky and ground. You could hear the sound of breathing, the rustle of fabric, the faint creak of seat frames straining under the weight of bodies bracing for impact. Inside the cockpit, time moved differently. The captain saw everything in sharp, painful detail: the runway angle, the airspeed needle dropping into dangerous territory, the trees at the edge of the airfield swaying in the wind. He eased back slightly on the control column, adjusting their glide angle with the precision of a surgeon. Too high and they'd overshoot the runway, plowing through the event grounds beyond. Too low and they'd slam into the treeline before even touching down. There was no time for second thoughts. There was no power to go around. They would either land here, or they would crash. Speed check, the first officer called out, voice tight but unwavering. The RAT turbine screamed against the wind, feeding just enough energy to keep the instruments alive, just enough control to steer. The altimeter spun downward, numbers falling like water through clenched fingers. Gear down and locked, the first officer reported, then corrected himself. Nose gear partially locked. The captain didn't flinch. He already knew. They'd seen the reading minutes earlier. If the nose gear collapsed on touchdown, they'd be plowing through the runway on steel. But at this point, that was a problem for after they survived the landing. The captain took a deep breath, steady and controlled. "We'll ride it in." Below them, people began to scatter. Someone shouted, pointing at the massive airliner bearing down on them. Children were dragged away from the track, cars peeled off the runway as fast as they could. But there was no stopping what was coming. The Boeing was descending fast, gliding lower and lower, casting a growing shadow over the tarmac. In the final seconds before touchdown, the inside of the cabin felt like a vacuum. The hum of conversation was gone. The world shrank to nothing but the soft whine of the air outside, the beating of hearts, and the captain's hands on the controls. The runway filled the windshield. Every instinct in the captain's body screamed that this was impossible. But training overrode fear. He leveled the wings, keeping the glide perfectly straight. There was no room for even a breath of error. "Hold it steady," the first officer whispered, not to him, but to himself. The aircraft crossed the threshold of the runway at terrifying speed. Passengers felt the lift drop beneath them, their stomachs rising into their throats as the ground came up to meet the plane. The main gear struck first, the sound echoing through the fuselage like thunder. The impact was brutal, violent, but controlled. The 767 bounced once, hard, then slammed down again with a metallic scream. Tires screeched against the cracked tarmac. Sparks exploded beneath the belly as the partially deployed nose gear folded under the weight, sending the nose crashing down into the runway. The sound inside the cabin was deafening, a howl of metal grinding against pavement, a chorus of screams, oxygen masks swaying wildly above passengers' heads. People were thrown forward against their seatbelts, some crying out, some too stunned to make a sound. Overhead bins rattled, loose items tumbled through the aisles, but the aircraft held together. It didn't break. Not yet. In the cockpit, both pilots fought for every inch of control. With no power to reverse thrust, no engines to help slow the aircraft, they used the only things left: brakes, spoilers, and drag. The captain pulled back on the control column to keep the nose as light as possible, to keep the front end from digging too deep. The first officer deployed the spoilers manually, their fingers moving with lightning speed across emergency levers. The plane skidded down the runway like a wounded beast, the screeching of metal and tires filling the air, smoke trailing behind it like a comet. On the ground, terrified spectators dove out of the way as the massive aircraft thundered past them. Some hit the ground and covered their heads. Others froze, watching history unfold in front of their eyes. Inside the plane, oxygen masks weren't needed, but fear made everything louder. A woman screamed for her child. Someone whispered, "Please, God," over and over. The smell of burning rubber filled the cabin. Sparks danced outside the windows. And yet, even in that chaos, the plane didn't veer off course. The captain kept it aligned, locked in on instinct and experience. The sound of the nose scraping against the pavement was unbearable, a low growl mixed with shrieking metal, but it meant they were still on the ground. Still sliding. Still alive. At the tail of the aircraft, Passengers could see the runway vanishing beneath them in streaks of gray and smoke. It felt endless, like the slide would never stop. Some clutched their heads, some closed their eyes, some stared straight ahead as if willing the aircraft to hold together just a little longer. Then, slowly, almost impossibly, the shrieking began to ease. The speed bled away. The heavy slide softened. The captain pulled the yoke back gently, easing what was left of the nose gear against the cracked runway, trying to minimize the damage. The aircraft skidded another 100 meters before finally, mercifully, it came to a grinding, trembling stop. For a single breath, there was no sound. Just stunned silence. And then, like a dam breaking, it all came rushing back. Gasps, sobs, the distant sound of footsteps as people outside began running toward the jet. The cockpit was filled with the smell of smoke, heat radiating up from the floor. The captain exhaled, shoulders trembling but hands still firm on the controls. The first officer stared straight ahead, breathing fast, sweat streaking down his forehead. They had done it. They had landed a powerless jet on a crowded, short runway with nothing but precision and instinct. In the cabin, passengers began to cry, not out of fear anymore, but from the shock of still being alive. People unclenched their hands from the armrests, leaving fingernail marks in the plastic. A woman sobbed into her husband's shoulder. A child whispered, "We stopped." Flight attendants, pale but composed, unbuckled their harnesses and prepared to do what they were trained to do next. The captain didn't have time to celebrate. "Evacuate," he ordered. "Evacuate now." That one word snapped the crew into action. The doors opened, slides deployed, and the silence that had haunted the flight was replaced with the rush of voices, footsteps, and the hiss of emergency equipment outside. What had started as a routine flight had ended with a powerless glide, a dead silent descent, and a landing no one would ever forget. And yet they were alive. Against every odd, every calculation, every ounce of fear, they had made it, for several long seconds after Air Canada Flight 143 stopped on the cracked runway of Gimli Industrial Park Airport. No one inside the aircraft moved. It was as if the entire cabin was frozen between disbelief and raw, unfiltered relief. Oxygen masks swayed softly from their overhead compartments, loose items lay scattered across the aisle, and the only sound that filled the air was the soft hiss of the wind outside. People were still strapped in their seats, breathing fast, eyes wide, hearts pounding from the violent landing. They had braced for death. For a fireball, for chaos. Instead, the giant steel bird had skidded to a stop, battered but whole, with every soul on board still breathing. The captain sat in the cockpit, his hands still on the controls as though letting go might undo everything that had just happened. His knuckles were white, sweat beading on his forehead, but his breathing had slowed, settling into something deeper, heavier, a kind of shock mixed with the realization of what they had just accomplished. Beside him, the first officer stared straight ahead at the cracked windshield, lips parted but silent. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The world outside was still catching up to the fact that they had pulled off the impossible. Then the captain's training snapped back into place like a switch being thrown. "Evacuate," he said, his voice steady but hoarse. It wasn't a request. It was a command. This landing was over, but the danger wasn't gone. The smell of burned rubber filled the air, a sharp, acrid scent that made people cough. Heat radiated up through the floor from the friction of the slide. And beneath the nose, metal groaned softly as it cooled, like an exhausted creature taking its last breath. The flight attendants moved like they were born for this moment. Their faces were pale but their actions were crisp, precise. Doors opened with practiced speed, slides hissed out and inflated, and a new kind of chaos filled the cabin. Not panic this time, but urgency. "Leave everything behind," one attendant shouted. "Go, go, go." Passengers unbuckled their belts with shaking hands, some struggling as adrenaline turned their fingers clumsy. A man fumbled with his laptop bag before a flight attendant ripped it from his grasp and shoved him toward the door. The priority was life, nothing else. People began sliding down the inflated chutes, some awkwardly tumbling, others clutching their children as tightly as they could. The cool air outside hit them like a wave, and many collapsed to their knees when they reached the ground, kissing the cracked pavement or holding each other in tearful silence. The crowd from the event who had scattered earlier was now running back, emergency crews forming out of nothing, firefighters, off-duty workers, even civilians rushing toward the aircraft, some carrying extinguishers, others shouting instructions. Inside the plane, not everyone moved right away. Some passengers were in shock, sitting frozen in their seats, staring blankly at the walls as if their brains hadn't caught up to the fact that they were alive. One flight attendant knelt beside an older woman who had fainted, shaking her gently until her eyes fluttered open. Another attendant helped a mother get her crying child to the door. The sound of commands filled the air, steady and clear. Head down. Jump and slide. Head down. Jump and slide. Over and over again. The captain was the last one to leave the cockpit. He looked at the instrument panel one final time, the dead dials and blank displays. It was eerie. This was a Boeing 767 that had flown hundreds of flights before. But this time, it had flown without its heart. And somehow, it had made it home. He stood, straightened his jacket, and stepped into the aisle, moving through the cabin with calm authority. "Let's go," he said softly to a stunned man clutching the armrest. "It's over. You're safe." Slowly, the last passengers shuffled toward the exits, their feet moving on autopilot. Outside, the scene was surreal. A massive jetliner sat in the middle of an old airfield, its nose buried in the tarmac, smoke curling up from its scraped underbelly. The landing gear had partially collapsed, and scorched rubber marked a long black trail behind it where sparks had flown. And around this scene, ordinary people, families, mechanics, event staff, stood with wide eyes, some crying, some whispering prayers, all of them witnessing a moment they'd never forget. This wasn't just an emergency landing. This was survival etched into the ground. Passengers gathered in clusters on the grass, wrapped in emergency blankets handed out by responding teams. Some were on their knees, crying quietly. Others sat in stunned silence, staring at the aircraft that had just carried them through hell. A young boy who had spent most of the flight staring out the window walked up to his father and whispered, "We stopped." His father pulled him into a tight hug, tears rolling down his cheeks. The captain walked down the last slide after ensuring everyone else was out. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud, and as he turned to face the aircraft, the full weight of what they had done settled on his chest. He looked at the nose of the plane, dented and scorched, and then at the long skid marks stretching down the runway like a scar. He hadn't just landed a jet. He had glided it silently out of the sky, threaded it through the narrowest margin of error, and brought it down without a single fatality. The first officer joined him, standing shoulder to shoulder in silence. There was no cheering. Just the sound of breathing, wind, and a few scattered sobs. Fire trucks arrived, but there was no explosion to fight. The aircraft was hot, bruised, bleeding hydraulic fluid, but alive. Emergency personnel fanned out, checking for injuries. A few passengers had scrapes and bruises, some twisted ankles from the slides, but no one had died. No one. In the world of air disasters, that was nothing short of a miracle. Reporters would later write that the landing of Flight 143 was like watching a ballet between gravity and human willpower. A powerless Boeing 767, falling silently from the sky, had been landed with such precision that the world would remember it as the Gimli glider incident. But for the people standing on that runway, it wasn't a story yet. It was a heartbeat, a breath, a second chance at life. The flight attendants moved through the crowd, checking on passengers, guiding them away from the aircraft in case something changed. The captain and first officer didn't leave the scene immediately. They stood a few feet from the plane, looking at it in silence. The first officer finally broke it, his voice quiet but shaky. "I can't believe we pulled that off." The captain nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. We didn't pull it off. Everyone did. His voice was low, heavy with everything he wasn't saying. The fear, the adrenaline, the unbearable responsibility of holding that plane steady when everything that could fail had failed. As more emergency vehicles arrived, the first signs of normalcy began to creep back in. Radios crackled. Medics guided passengers toward buses. The air was still tense, but it wasn't filled with panic anymore. It was filled with relief. A kind of quiet relief that sits heavy on the chest. But amid that relief, there was also awe. A powerless jetliner wasn't supposed to land like this. It wasn't supposed to touch down on an abandoned runway filled with people and cars and survive without anyone dying. Yet here it was, the scarred body of the aircraft standing as silent proof of what determination, skill, and human composure could do in the face of disaster. As dusk began to creep across the horizon, casting long shadows across the old airfield, one of the ground workers whispered to a colleague, "They landed with no engines?" The other nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the jet. "Yeah. No engines. Nothing but a glide." That quiet whisper carried through the crowd. And in that moment, the legend of Flight 143 wasn't just born, it was felt. A story that had started as a routine flight, turned into a silent fall from the sky, and ended with 200 people standing on solid ground. It was a moment no one who lived through it would ever forget. Hours after Air Canada Flight 143 came to its grinding, powerless stop on the cracked runway of Gimli Industrial Park Airport, the chaos slowly gave way to something else, an eerie, unforgettable quiet. The aircraft sat there like a wounded giant in the fading light, its nose buried against the ground, metal scorched, tires shredded, the long black trail of rubber and sparks stretching behind it like the memory of a nightmare. Emergency crews surrounded the jet, flashing lights painting the scene in shades of red and blue, but the worst was over. Against all odds, no one had died. Every soul on board was standing on solid ground. The passengers had been moved away from the aircraft, wrapped in silver emergency blankets that fluttered softly in the wind. Many were sitting on the grass or the cold tarmac, some holding hands, some staring blankly at the massive airplane that had almost become their tomb. The silence was strange, heavy, but not empty. It was the silence of hundreds of people processing the same impossible thought: we survived. A young mother sat with her son in her lap, still rocking him even though he wasn't crying anymore. An elderly couple held each other so tightly their knuckles had turned white. A man sat alone, hands shaking as he stared at his palms, as if they could still feel the weight of the armrests he'd gripped so hard during the landing. Inside the cockpit, the captain remained for a long while after everyone else had left. The instrument panel was dark, silent. What had once been a living, breathing machine now felt more like the shell of something that had fought and won a war. He sat there, helmet of calm still on, his hands resting on the yoke. His mind replayed every second of the descent. The low warning tones, the silent fall through the sky, the runway appearing too fast, the moment the wheels hit and the nose collapsed, the sparks, the screaming metal. It wasn't supposed to end like this. A powerless aircraft wasn't supposed to glide that far, that accurately, onto a strip that small. And yet it had. The first officer returned quietly, stepping into the cockpit like someone entering a church. He didn't speak for a moment, just stared at the lifeless instrument panel. Then, in a soft, shaky breath, he said, "We should be dead." The captain didn't look up. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, we should." His voice was steady, but inside, the weight of responsibility pressed down hard. It wasn't just about skill. It had been a razor-thin line between survival and disaster. A few knots too fast, too slow, too high, too low, and the runway would have been a crater, not a landing strip. Outside, the investigation teams were already gathering, their reflective jackets gleaming in the dimming light. Officials from Transport Canada were en route. Air crash investigators would descend on the site before dawn. Reporters would follow. This landing was unlike anything the world had seen in modern aviation, a commercial Boeing 767 that had lost all power at cruising altitude and still landed with no fatalities. The world would soon call it the Gimli glider incident, but for the people on that runway, it wasn't a headline. It was a heartbeat. It was the sound of tires screeching against pavement, of metal screaming and not giving in. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the captain finally stepped out of the plane, down the emergency slide, and into the cool night air. The moment his boots touched the ground, people turned to look at him. Passengers, firefighters, ground crews, even locals who had rushed in to help, all of them fell silent as he passed. He didn't look like a hero. His uniform was smeared with sweat, dust, and streaks of black rubber. His eyes were tired, heavy with everything he'd carried in the cockpit. But to everyone watching, he was the man who'd done the impossible. A passenger approached him, a middle-aged woman with shaking hands, and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice cracked halfway through the word. Then another person said it. And another. Soon the crowd rippled with quiet gratitude, tears, and disbelief. People had boarded that plane expecting an ordinary day. They had lived through a silent plunge through the sky, the terrifying glide toward an uncertain end, and somehow they were still here to say thank you. A few yards away, the first officer crouched on the tarmac, running a hand through his hair, letting the night air cool the heat in his chest. One of the flight attendants sat nearby, tears streaking down her face, the adrenaline finally fading from her body. She had shouted the word "brace" over and over, expecting the worst. Instead, she was watching the passengers she'd prepared for impact breathing, crying, laughing softly in relief. Then came the media. The flashing cameras. The endless questions. Officials wanted statements, timelines, explanations. How did they keep control? How did they glide so far? How did no one die? But for the crew, there were no grand speeches to give. There was just the raw memory of the silence. That moment when the engines went out at 41,000 feet and the cockpit became nothing but wind and heartbeat. In the days that followed, investigators would piece together the truth. A simple fueling miscalculation, a confusion between pounds and kilograms, meant the aircraft had taken off with less than half the fuel it needed. It was a human error, simple but deadly. Yet it was also human skill that had kept that error from becoming tragedy. The captain's calm precision, the first officer's focus, the flight attendant's clear instructions, and the passenger's trust had all threaded together into a narrow, miraculous path between life and death. The story spread like wildfire. The media called it the glider plane that should have crashed but didn't. Experts around the world marveled at the glide path calculations. Pilots whispered in admiration. In aviation schools, the incident became a case study for decades to come. But for the people who lived it, it wasn't a story about math or procedure. It was about feeling the world fall silent around you and somehow refusing to let it end that way. Weeks later, the aircraft was repaired and returned to service, but the scars from that night never truly faded. For the captain, the sound of the engines dying midair would echo for the rest of his life. For passengers, every flight afterward carried a shadow of that glide. For some, it brought fear. For others, it brought awe. Because they knew, when everything failed, humanity didn't. And for years to come, when people spoke of Flight 143, they didn't just talk about the miscalculation that brought it down. They talked about the impossible landing, the silent glide, the calm hands on the controls, the cries that turned into laughter on a runway that should have been a grave. That night at Gimli became more than an air disaster story. It became proof that even when machines fail, human courage can hold the sky. If you've been with me through this story, thank you for listening. These aren't just tales of engines and metal. They're stories of people, ordinary people, facing the extraordinary. If you'd like to hear more powerful, real stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these voices alive, so their courage is never forgotten.